All right, girls, I apologize, but you're going to have to look at a good um, Democratic photo. All right, while I do this, I think I'm going to go through each one of these readings, all right, that you did, the Roche reading and the Beard reading, and try and answer these questions for you. John Roche's article on the framing of the Constitution has been accepted as the classical piece on what actually occurred at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. When the article first appeared in 1961, its thesis was a startling contrast with the generally accepted notion that the framers were either all-wise Platonic guardians or a conspiratorial economic elite, adhering either to abstract principles of political theory or advancing proposals to protect economic interests. In either case, no one before Roche had as forcefully presented a view that the Constitutional Convention was essentially a Democratic Reform caucus. The so-called principles of the Constitution, he writes, were not essentially based upon theoretical considerations or a conspiracy to preserve elite power, but upon the practical political trade-offs among the different state interests that had to be reconciled in order to make the idea of a national constitution palatable at home. So the first question asks you, what does Roche mean when he describes the Constitutional Convention as a Democratic Reform caucus? To quote, all right, the Philadelphia Convention was not a college of cardinals or a council of Platonic guardians working within a manipulative, free democratic framework. It was a nationalist reform caucus, which had to operate with great delicacy and skill in a political cosmos full of enemies to achieve the one definitive goal, popular approbation, unquote. Question 2. What were the major political constraints operating during the Constitutional Convention? One of the most important constraints was the existence of powerful states with strong views on state sovereignty that had to be accommodated in various ways, which were reflected in the compromises of the convention. And we talked about that, okay, as we talked about things in class, in your book. Number 3. All right. Although the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were not elitists in the Beardian sense, most of the framers did share certain political views, which they sought to institutionalize over strong opposition in the country. How does Roche characterize the framers of the Constitution? An interesting amalgam of a few dedicated nationalists with the self-interested spokesmen of various parochial bailiwicks, quote unquote. They possessed a continental approach to political, economic, and military issues. Question 4. What does Roche feel was the role of political theory at the Constitutional Convention? Essentially, that theory was the servant of practical political necessity. Quote, while the shades of Locke and Montesquieu may have been hovering in the background, and the delegates may have been unconscious instruments of a transcendent telos, the careful observer of the day-to-day work of the convention finds no overarching principles. The separation of powers to him seems to be a byproduct of suspicion, and federalism he views as an alternative, as the furthest point the delegates felt they could go in the destruction of state power without themselves inviting repudiation, unquote. In other words, all right, it was like the ultimate answer for them in order to get rid of state power, but yet not to destroy states as they existed. What evidence is there that the retrospective symmetry given to the Constitution by the Federalists has been influential in the American political tradition? The Federalist essentially supplied the theory of the Constitution that has become accepted in our political tradition. Witness the many citations to the Federalist in Supreme Court decisions, the Federalist Papers we're talking about, and in political literature generally. Regardless of what different framers may have thought they were doing, the fact is that the constitutional system they established is consistent with certain theoretical principles, and the Federalist helps to explain these. Now we go to the next reading, Charles A. Beard, Framing the Constitution. The selection by Charles A. Beard on the framing of the Constitution is taken from his book, The Supreme Court and the Constitution, 1912, which appeared 1 year before his famous work mentioned in your textbook, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, 1913. The earlier work contains a concise statement of the famous economic theme of Beard, which was that the Constitution reflected nothing more nor less than the work of an economic elite that was out to protect its own interests against possible incursions from popular majorities. Beard's elite consisted of landholders, creditors, merchants, public bondholders, and wealthy lawyers, all of whom were well represented at the Constitutional Convention. Just as Roche's thesis of a democratic constitutional convention was startling in 1961, Beard's conspiratorial economic elite theme had a profound impact after it appeared in full form in 1913. At that time, the prevailing view was that the Constitution had been formulated by wise philosopher kings who impartially followed the dictates of accepted political theory in deciding what was best for the nation. Before Beard, the folklore of American democracy suggested at a minimum that the framers of the Constitution, although an elite, were nevertheless looking out for the best interests of the people. Beard, however, suggested that in effect, the Convention of 1787 was a conspiracy of an economic elite. After reading Beard, you may ask about the Constitutional Convention. Who is right, Roche or Beard? We can look at a few quotes from an individual's work, Robert E. Brown's work, on Charles Beard and the Constitution, where he analyzed, some of Beard's statements. It may help to illustrate that although Beard was indeed interesting and provocative, his evidence does not support his conclusions. Robert Brown states this, and I quote, "Having reviewed all this evidence on the economic holdings of the convention delegates, the important question is whether Beard's historical method justified his conclusions that personal property was responsible for the Constitution. The answer must be an emphatic no. Anyone would concede that the Founding Fathers had education, property, and influence far greater than the average at that time. But the same would be true of colonial legislatures, the Confederation Congress, and legislators today. Had Beard cited this evidence to prove that the convention delegates represented property in general and were interested in a government which would protect property, he would have been on firm ground. All the delegates believed in the sanctity of property. Some even believed that the chief function of government was the protection of property. This was undoubtedly important, but it was not their only concern. Beard did not contend, however, that the convention was rigged to protect property in general. What he emphasized was personality, personal property, and in fact a particular kind of personality which did not include livestock and slaves. We shall see later that he even refined personal property to mean predominantly one kind of personal property, public securities. A principal source of Beard in support of his economic argument, and that was the end of the quote before that. A principal source of Beard in his economic argument was the Federalist. However, as Brown points out, although the authors of the Federalist Papers did appeal to economic interests, they also appealed to many other interests and sentiments, as can be observed in all of the selections from the Federalist Papers. The need for limited government, detailed by Madison in Papers 47, 48, and 51, is not premised on the need to protect private property, but on the need to prevent tyranny, the fallibility of man, and the natural division of governmental power into legislative, executive, and judicial categories. By contrast, note that Hamilton argued in Federalist 70 that an energetic executive was essential for good government. Hamilton was in favor of protecting private property, as were all of the delegates to the convention, and a vigorous executive could be interpreted as essential to preserve property, as can most other provisions of the Constitution. A strong and effective national government, which at the time is constructed in such a way that popular majorities cannot control it, can become the instrument of an economic elite in the preservation of its interests. However, such a government serves other purposes, such as national defense, political stability, and uniformity of laws, which benefit many interests in society apart from significant property holders. Now to your questions. Number 1 is a lengthy question. Contrast philosophy and forces behind the Articles of Confederation with those supporting the new Constitution in 1787. Response. Beard observes that the revolutionists, Samuel Adams, Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, among others, were not, generally speaking, men of large property interests or of much practical business experience. In a time of disorder, they could consistently lay more stress upon personal liberties than upon social control, and they pushed to the extreme limits those doctrines of individual rights which had been evolved in England during the struggles of the small landed proprietors and commercial classes against royal prerogative, and which corresponded to the economic conditions prevailing in America at the close of the 18th century. They associated strong government with monarchy, and came to believe that the best political system was one which governs the least. A majority of the radicals viewed all government, especially if highly centralized, as a species of evil, tolerable only because necessary and always to be kept down to an irreducible minimum by jealous vengeance. The emphasis of the revolutionists upon the need to preserve individual freedom from governmental interference, particularly from the power of the national government, led to a weak Articles of Confederation that failed, quote, to accomplish the accepted objects of government, namely national defense, the protection of property, and the advancement of commerce, unquote. Note here that Beard does not as forcefully present the thesis that the Constitution represented the interests of the property classes as he did in his An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. Most of the revolutionists who supported Articles of Confederation in the first place did not wish to see a new and powerful national government, although some, such as Jefferson, clearly supported the new Constitution with certain reservations. To Beard, the Constitution of 1787 reflected the emergence of a new class of persons with power, namely the men of business and property and the holders of public securities. The philosophy behind and conditions leading to the Constitution of 1787 are stated by Beard in the following terms, quote, "The close of the revolutionary struggle removed the prime cause for radical agitation, and brought a new group of thinkers into prominence. When independence has been gained, the practical work to be done was the maintenance of social order, the payment of the public debt, the provision of a sound financial system, and the establishment of conditions favorable to the development of the economic resources of the new country." Question 2. What was the effect of the state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation upon the dominant economic classes? I quote Beard as the response. Under the state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation established during the Revolution, every powerful economic class in the nation suffered either immediate losses or from impediments placed in the way of the development of their enterprises. Unquote. 3. How does Beard characterize the delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787? Response. They were an economic, political, and intellectual elite. Although Beard graphically refers to the economic elitist characteristics of the delegates, he also paints them as intellectual, patriotic, and political giants of their time. The economic theme becomes clear as Beard writes that, quote, the makers of the federal Constitution represent the solid, conservative, commercial, and financial interests of the country, not the interests which denounced and proscribed judges in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and North Carolina, and stoned their houses in New York. The conservative interests, made desperate by the imbecilities of the Confederation and harried by state legislatures, roused themselves from their lethargy, drew together in a mighty effort to establish a government that would be strong enough to pay the national debt, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, provide for national defense, prevent fluctuations in the currency created by paper emissions, and control the propensities of legislative majorities to attack private rights. The radicals, however, like Patrick Henry, Jefferson, and Sam Adams, were conspicuous by their absence from the convention. Unquote. What were the views of the delegates to the convention on democracy and equality, according to Beard? And I quote, every page of the record of proceedings of the convention preserved to posterity by Mr. Madison shows conclusively that the members of that assembly were not seeking to realize any fine notions about democracy and equality, but were striving with all resources of political wisdom at their command to set up a system of government that would be stable and efficient, safeguarded on the one hand against the possibilities of despotism and on the other against the onslaught of majority. Question 5. Aside from describing the delegates as representatives of the property classes desiring to protect their interests, what other evidence does Beard present to support his thesis that the principal purpose of the Constitution was to protect most forms of private property? Slaves and livestock were excluded from the property to be protected, which mostly included public securities. Beard writes that the delegates, quote, were anxious about everything else to safeguard the rights of private property against any leveling tendencies on the part of the propertyless masses, unquote. James Madison made strong arguments for property qualifications for voting, but these were not adopted by the convention because it, quote, could not agree on the nature and amount of the qualifications, unquote. Beard argues that the principal purpose of the system of checks and balances was to protect property rights. Quote, nevertheless, by the system of checks and balances placed in the government, the convention safeguarded the interests of property by attacks by majority, unquote. The arguments of Federalist 10 are introduced by Beard, who suggests that Madison recognized a natural inequality due to the unequal distribution of property, and that the constitutional system should take this inevitability into account by guarding against the possibility of a majority faction forming that would dispossess minority property holders. Beard returns to his point regarding the checks and balances system as a major check against majorities, and therefore those dispossessed of property, noting that this very system of checks and balances, which is undeniably the essential element of the Constitution, is built upon the doctrine that the popular branch of the government cannot be allowed full sway, and least of all in the enactment of laws touching the rights of property, unquote. Question 6. Beard relies upon the Federalist Papers to support his argument that the Constitution was designed to protect the economic interest of property holders. In the selection you have read, what arguments does Beard make based on the Federalist Papers to support his conclusions? Beard cites the Federalist Papers a number of times to indicate that the overriding concerns of the framers related to economic matters. Beard cites the 10th paper of the Federalist Papers in support of his claim that the leaders of the convention recognized the maldistribution of wealth and feared its consequences. Oh, think of that sentence in terms of today. Beard notes that page after page of the Federalist Papers is directed to that portion of the electorate that was disgusted with the mutability of the public's councils. The legislative power was to be feared, said the author of the Federalist paper, and Hamilton argued that a presidential veto was necessary to curb the unreasoned passions of the legislature. Beard notes that Hamilton argued in the Federalist Papers that it was important that the process of ratification of the Constitution be removed from the direct control of the people. Parenthetically, some students may be interested in the esoteric argument discussed by John Roche that the Federalist is not an accurate description of the philosophy of the framers, since it was largely campaign propaganda for the ratification of the Constitution. Question 5, previously, in reference to Roche's piece, gives views on the importance of the Federalist Papers in constitutional interpretations, even though it was after the fact. Beard, who greatly relies upon the Federalist Papers, notes also that it was a piece of campaign literature, but nevertheless has remained a permanent part of the contemporary sources on the Constitution and has been regarded by many lawyers as a commentary second in value only to the decisions of the Supreme Court.